Hi, I'm Andre. Tom. Hi.
Hi everyone.
Hi. I run Authentise. Thank you for dialing in. Here's a presentation that Tom and I gave first at Rapid. Hopefully slightly improved now with a bit of learning, but already back in Boston, a fairly major sort of insight, got the room going. Thought do it again in the virtual world, spread the news more widely. But primarily, we want to talk to you about, so this is Tom and I. We want to talk to you about intent, why it matters, and that's something that we've been thinking about for feels like an eternity. And then talk about the product we just released to capture that intent. Tom will then talk about what that intent can drive in terms of generative design and geometry, and some areas that will change as intent becomes a more prevalent tool. And I'll speak a little bit about how that will start affecting the engineering process and obviously some of the questions that arise out of that. So to get right into it, just a quick reminder for those of you who don't know about Authentise. We're a software company. We make manufacturing engineering workflow software. I've been around for over 14 years now for my sins. There are a number of relatively large companies that support us and partner with us. We started initially in production management software, branched out slightly to also have a digital warehousing solution. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've been really interested in engineering collaboration, and more recently, still in the last couple of months, released an agentic version of that engineering collaboration tool I'll speak about now. So that's Whisper. So, but before I start there, just take you back into why intent matters so much. Just a very, very high level scenario. Imagine we're designing a part for LPBF in Type 64. We create that part, right? Now we want to ask, we want to send that information to somebody else. And in fact, I just attended a America Makes and MOD talk about how difficult it is just send that over the wall and get somebody else to make it, right? But imagine even further down the line, 5 or 10 years, there's a new manufacturing capability, and I want to make edits to that design, and then remanufacture it to address or incorporate the new capabilities that I've just been given, right? That's clearly not enough. But in reality, what's happening is that document that we're creating, the technical data package, is a summary of information that we've generated previously, all kinds of structured and unstructured information. That's where the intent lies. And the challenge is that to date, very little of that information is being recorded in the TDP, and basically the moment it's created, it's lost. So what our key insight is that this is 90% of the decisions that we made, the why behind an engineering decision, it isn't recorded, and as a result, that leaves us with relatively stale documents that are hard to use and implement. So what we've realized is that beyond the performance constraints that you might imagine utilizing in a generative design tool, this is related to what manufacturing capability do I have, what regulation am I bound to, what experience do I have in the room. So there's a whole set of different knowledge that's driving the decisions towards the final part design and the technical data package. And currently that's just not incorporated. The technical data package, the report that's generated doesn't capture all of those nuances and decisions that are being generated. So what did we do about it? We generated Whisper. Whisper was born basically 4 years ago when we started with Threads, and that's an engineering collaboration. So it was our first attempt to capture all that intent, all the whys, and that tool functionally works great. We had some experiences with the Air Force deploying this in large projects and being able to derive really clear insights, functional insights from the process as a result of having the data captured in one place. So broadly speaking, Threads captures the conversation, allows you to connect your video call transcripts. You can upload any additional information. So you have one place to collaborate, annotate the model, upload documents. So pretty much if you use it right, all the information is being captured there. But the reality is that most people will never use a new tool like that because they already have a form of collaboration. So they're not going to change their method of working to just be able to capture all that intent. There's an inertia around that change. So really, if capturing intent, and I hope we've persuaded you here that that's important, the capturing intent is key. We can't rely on user interfaces to capture that intent. We need to think behind the scenes, and that's what Whisper does. And Whisper captures the information where it's generated, categorizes that information, and then applies permissions and context onto that, so it understands the implied permissions of that information. Just give you a quick sense of what that actually means. Here's just a simple example. Somebody's going in the environment that they live in every day, like Slack, could be Teams or anywhere else, and does a quick search against all those structured and unstructured databases, receiving answers in response in clear English. In a more sort of complex example, this is a dashboard that compares that background chatter to existing standards that you might have to adhere to. So it identifies those standards, it understands what you need to do in order to comply with those standards, and it helps you generate reports that reflect your standards adherence. And so, there are lots of different ways of utilizing that intent data in the near term. So while we're talking here about something that has sort of a long breadth, and Tom will go into that a little bit in the next couple of slides, what we realize that intent data actually matters quite a lot today. One more use case could be you've got that Whisper data coming through, and we send you a Teams or Slack message every time we notice that your project management tool is out of sync with your background chatter, right? So just another example. Lots of different types of opportunities in the near term that can utilize or be built on top of that intent data. But the most exciting for us, or for me personally, is how we can connect that to tools like ToffeeX. So I'll hand it over to Tom to tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so thanks, Andre. Yeah, my name's Thomas. I work for ToffeeX, and I'd like to take a little bit of time now. So Andre talked a lot about intent in the abstract, and once I introduce ToffeeX, we'll talk a little bit about a concrete example of intent, and how that concretely affects an engineering decision making. But first, ToffeeX. So I guess some you might already be familiar, but we're a CAE tool. So we are a specialist tool for the design and optimization and simulation of thermofluid components. And concretely, our customers use our tool to optimize components like heat exchangers, cold plates, manifolds, injection molding tooling, conformal cooling, and so on. So just on the next slide, there's a couple of cool examples of production parts manufactured using ToffeeX. And what you'll notice immediately, except for the one in the middle where all the interesting stuff is on the inside of that part, the components generated with ToffeeX are really complex in terms of geometry and often in terms of operation. And that complexity is kind of very, very important to the rest of this discussion. So concretely then, what does it, when we're working with CAE tools and we're doing engineering design, the engineering software that we're using essentially sees a lot of numbers, right? It sees parameters, it sees constraints, it sees objectives. So here's some examples, right? You know, you have a geometry envelope, you might have your boundary conditions, you might have like flow rates or heat fluxes or you know, static loads or dynamic loads. You have your fluid and or structural properties, your material properties. You might have geometry requirements for manufacturing. You might have you obviously will have performance requirements and so on. And what this captures, you know, is a lot about the individual performance of a component. And you know, that's important, but really that's not the story of the engineering decision making, right? So this is kind of just this is a turning of the handle, right? This rather than any sort of like active decision making process. And that those decision making sort of like touch points kind of really are where engineers are earning their money, right? Right. So this is exactly what I said. You know, solver will deliver what you ask for, but what you want is actually on the next slide. You got problems like if you click through these, Andre. Well, we're making decisions based on previous design experience. We're making decisions based on damage tolerance and robustness or degradation over time, fatigue failure. We've got regulatory and compliance rules that we need to follow, and certification as well is a huge problem. Well, it's not a problem, but it's an obligation in aerospace and defense, and obviously economics, cost, all these things. These are actually where the engineering decision making happens. It doesn't happen in, oh, my flow rate is this. And it's that translation layer, actually, that translation layer that goes from these are my engineering requirements, which keep in mind, you know, that's not the same thing as my heat flux or my heat dissipation needs to be this. The engineering requirements are things about cost, manufacturing, regulatory certification, and the numbers that go into making a component. So so to illustrate this in a very concrete example, we're gonna show a workflow with Toffee where we're trying to basically design a heat exchanger. So this is kind of a dumb example. It's a very simple example of a heat exchanger, and it doesn't really capture the full complexity of a real sort of like automotive oil cooler. But essentially, you know, in a heat exchanger, you've got a hot side. In this case, it's engine oil, and then you got a cold side. In this case, it's a coolant, which is probably some sort of like propylene glycol mixture. And you know, if you just looked at the really naive approach to the engineering process, you're thinking, okay, well, I need to, I have this pump available to me. Got to pump this through, and I need to achieve this kind of heat transfer. And so you might put all those numbers into Toffee, and you'll get a design like this, which is great. Because this will meet all your performance requirements. The numbers will all be correct, but obviously this doesn't capture, this is not appropriate for an automotive manufacturer, right? You cannot take a heat exchanger that's shaped like this and put it and manufacture it at scale and sell it at scale. So there needs to be extra information provided. And so with a few other bells and whistles attached to Toffee, which I'm not going to go into right now, you can design the same heat exchanger, but you can get many different designs that sort of satisfy various requirements. And here's 3 examples, right? So this is the same heat exchanger, it's the same numbers, but they're very clearly different. So the question now is which of these is best for your application, and what set of inputs, what set of rules did you follow to get the answer which is best for your application? And it's that information, that richness of information, which is the design intent for this specific application. So here's the problem, right? Where I think at least we think an automated capture of design intent can really help engineering organizations, right? So it's essentially a latency problem. So if you imagine like the day-to-day life of engineers working in an office, people are working on a problem, and yeah, they'll have a requirements document and they'll have some sort of like baseline, but they're still trying to crack this problem. And learning generally doesn't happen, by reading a book in this context, right? So it's normally conversations between colleagues, meetings, making a realization while interpreting results. It's asking questions. It's emails from customers, emails from suppliers, and there's this highly complex rate of learning which kind of informs the design intent. Conversations with like experienced engineers as well, and there's basically, because it's kind of in this nebulous form in Slack conversations and emails and meeting minutes and meeting recordings, and various kind of sketches and documents that are floating around. It takes a very long time, if ever, for this information to be formalized and essentially captured in the sort of like the hive mind of the company. Right, so there is a delay. There's if it does make it in, and when it does make it in, it doesn't contain that same sort of richness of information that might have been conveyed first. So you have a compression and an information loss. And when it comes to design of components, right, it takes a long time, sort of days or even weeks probably, before a component can be redesigned with what the engineer has learned. And along that process, information is lost, it's compressed, and then maybe at some point, if you're lucky, once you're reporting on the component design, it might get written down at some point. And this is not a problem that can be solved organizationally, because this is a fundamentally human problem. You cannot sort of like dictate that this gets fixed. And automated intent capture essentially avoids all the lossy compression and delay stages, because as soon as the learning happens, again, whether it's in a Slack conversation or a Teams call or an email or whatever it is automatically captured in the background. So you skip everything, and the whole entire like richness of information is captured. And what can happen is, if it's all programmatic as well, when it comes to redesign, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail with agentic AI, redesign can happen automatically with that knowledge, and it gets documented automatically. So you have this really powerful way of bypassing essentially all the problematic issues with capturing and recording the engineering intent behind the component.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So how this, just briefly how this looks in reality is that the users, customers, the engineers that are working on the project, any specialists, material scientists that are talking about the problem, Whisper can capture that information, and the output of that is then kicked off, used to kick off the actual design process. Then you send that via API to ToffeeX. ToffeeX can design that information. It basically uses a set of parameters, displays those to the user, and generates an output that the user can then review again. And the same is true, as Thomas just said, for the reverse engineering process or the re-engineering process. As more information becomes available, as information flows in from the field, from uses, from tests, that those data points are also held. Any changes to the requirements are displayed to the user, and then ToffeeX can generate a new version of that design. So it really becomes compared to the lossy extended process that Thomas just described, the potential is to radically reduce the time it takes to turn an idea into a part. But obviously there's challenges, Thomas.
Yes, yeah. But we can talk about challenges later. But this list is kind of more of a, maybe this is very, very thought leadery here. But you can with the way things are going, it's not, you can imagine a world where it's not just relaunching a design through an existing API, right? If you've captured some concepts that might be quite nebulous, but you managed to capture it automatically and record it completely, and it expresses a need or a requirement or an approach to solving a problem. Again, one of the advantages of agentic AI is they can also write code, right? So you can imagine a world where it's not enough that an agent captures intent and automatically launches a simulation or a design process. It can also write new tools which can answer the questions posed in that design process, right? So in taking a longer term view, and this is very much a longer term view, if you have an agent which understands intent and you have an agent which understands the software underlying the solver, there can be a dialogue between the two, and new features can specifically be written and created to answer the requirements expressed by the customer agent. And reminder that the requirements expressed by the customer agent is just a reflection of the engineering understanding within that organization. So you have a prospect where a competitive moat essentially basically removes the concept of who can afford the best software, and it moves entirely to who has the best engineers. And this is kind of a compelling little thought experiment that we think tools like this, when built together, it's an interesting way to think about what could be.
I mean, for me, this was one of the most interesting outputs of the discussions we've had, Thomas, is the ability, instead of thinking about a fixed parameter set that you squeeze the intent into, so to speak, with Whisper, then that then drives the ToffeeX process. How about we expand the parameter set on the fly, given that the intent is showing us a much broader field that we want to be acting in. So, and that becomes a reality with agentic development. It's super interesting. And obviously throws up a whole bunch of questions beyond how software is written. The first is a question on whether people want their information, the background chatter to be tracked. Whisper was built right from the start to address those issues. So it's on premise. You can see the source code. Any GDPR compliance issues are addressed, or similar California requirements are addressed in the way we build it. And for us, the human is always in the loop. Those might change. That might change over time, depending on what the user wants to be in the loop for. But that's what's currently built in. And the whole system will evolve. Right now, if you think about Whisper doing three things: capturing data, categorizing it, and understanding implied permissions. That understanding implied permissions is just one example of where things might shift. Right now it's defined by folder access, or the role you hold within an organization. It's quite black and white. But in the future, you might have people who have a need for information, and their agent discusses with a gatekeeper agent on whether they can have access, even though they don't have formal access requirements. So that we're seeing evolution in this whole kind of journey as it goes along. So, where we see this journey going is that we've launched Whisper. We're currently in the process of building more operational effectors. That means, things that help in the short term utilize that information, real-time Gantt charts, risk assessments, report writing, anything that has that kind of short-term ROI. But obviously the opportunity for ToffeeX and Authentise to collaborate through grants and other partnerships to deliver on the promises we've discussed today are huge. So appreciate you being here today and having the ability to share this story again. But I do hope that you're also going to be part of the journey going forward. So if there are questions related to, as Thomas said, the thought experiments we've been putting together over the last few months, be delighted to answer them now. While we're waiting for people to unmute themselves, Thomas, like, where are we in the simulation generative design space? How close are we to a reality? And what's stopping us from being able to kind of formalize this? Is it a regulatory issue? Is it a technology issue?
From my perspective, it's a time and money issue, to be honest. So for ToffeeX, we're all the inputs are to our tool is just a list of numbers, right? So any list of numbers is accessible via a programmable API. And I guess what the real thing that's missing is kind of like some understanding of this expression of what I want will translate to this set of numbers that I want to put in. But that's just a data gathering exercise, right? Yeah, the optimization process and the simulation, it's all a bunch of nonlinear equations and it's complicated, but we have a bunch of really good tools at tracking nonlinear correlations right now. And so for me, from my perspective, like it's a data gathering moat that we need to kind of cross, and then it's just having the time to and the I guess also the demands from people who see the opportunity here to write this tool.
Yeah, I hear that. The opportunities that I've seen, I've seen two mega trends driving this. The first is that a lot more of this intent data is now online because of COVID. It's taught us all to work online, so we've got this digital information that we can utilize. And the second is our ability to process that digital information, whether it's structured or unstructured, has been revolutionized by LLMs, right? So it's actually the first time in human history that we've had the ability to process this much information in a relatively short time frame. So that's really exciting, and it's something that I think it's going to take a while for there to be the mental shift that people can actually accept that. People understand what, and then start using that in a way that's conducive. We're all playing around with ChatGPT at the moment, but with generating context for each query on the fly, we're not really learning from all the other activities that are going on. So I'm interested to see how quickly organizations are able to adopt the capture side of this problem. As you just said, the data has to be gathered, and it's encouraging to hear from you that, wow, we're actually much closer than
we're very close.
People think.
We got a question from Thomas Spears here, Andre, who's asking how does Whisper parse emails, Teams chats, and documents to ensure that the implied decisions end up associated with the right objective?
We tag him, right? I mean, you have information that comes in single sources. So you have a project milestone presentation that's pretty clear, but you have an email, it might include 3 different topics. So you embed that information and you tag that information with different tags. So the categorization, we call it, of that problem is currently kind of a relatively solved problem. What we're doing to reduce token counts is that we don't embed everything straight away. So we operate under an 80-20 rule. This really depends on your deployment method, but we expect 80% of the value to be locked into 20% of the documents or 20% of the chat. So we embed only those 20% based on the queries that we're getting in, and then being able to process that information and then reuse those embeddings as we go on. It's a good question, though, and I don't think the answer is any different from your traditional categorization that you have normally. Hope that answers the question. Love others. And it's also an opportunity for us that I've dialed into this call to collaborate and think about how we might do this together, right? Because this is certainly not a novel idea. One of the things that I had a conversation with the British Ministry of Defence, and I was encouraging them to start thinking about, instead of requiring technical data packages, can you actually require companies to provide the source material for those technical data packages and prove to the MOD for final acceptance that that source information can reconstitute a TDP on the fly, right? So and that really future-proofs, that would address a lot of the sustainment issues that you're having to deal with at the moment. So that if you can grasp that intent, if you can force companies to provide that, not only the final deliverable, how much more likely are you able to adapt the design in the future given new constraints or capabilities that you might have in the field? And so I think that there's a huge opportunity in from a compliance perspective to make people explore this. But it's a journey, and please do reach out to us if you want to join that journey. What
about that? One last question, Andre. How does one get their hands on Whisper?
We come up, hit me up here. We'll do a deployment. It's a really easy tool to deploy locally, and it's managed open source, so you don't even have to license it from us on an ongoing basis. So, great question. Thank you.